The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello and welcome to the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and today we are chatting with Russ Dodge. Russ Dodge and I go back a few years. We're both death nerds, and I think that's a term I'm sure he's probably not really a fan of. What do you think? What do we call it?
I'm good with it. It's fine.
You're going to go with death nerd? Okay, great. So we're going to go with death nerd. Russ is a volunteer at the Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, has in the past been associated with cemetery transcription projects, both for the 23rd New Jersey Yahoo Regiment, findagrave.com, and is an active Civil War historian. Russ, tell us a little bit about what's going on these days.
What's going on these days? Well, it's entering 2022 and another slate of tours at Laurel Hill. And we actually are going to do even more expanded than we have for the last couple of years. COVID was obviously a little tough for us.
I think we can say that sucked for all of us, really, for sure.
Sucked for all of us. There were no in-person tours from April 2021 and 2020, excuse me, till August 2020. We did some virtual tours, but then the actual very first COVID era tour was done by myself for my Gettysburg tour, but it was
fantastic.
Yeah, so had not 10 people wrapped up, all in masks, walking around in August heat. It was fun. It was great. But it was actually good to be back in the cemetery though, and actually leading people around.
Now, something about the tours at Laurel Hill. I know that you do a Gettysburg tour. I know there's a lot of Civil War history at Laurel Hill, being your personal. But wouldn't you say that, I think in addition to some of the tours most people would expect, like your Civil War and your historical tours, there's a couple of really creative tour concepts at Laurel Hill, are there not? Absolutely.
Like that, most of my tours are generally my scheduled tours, the theme tours that are on their schedule are historical of nature, like a Revolutionary tour, a Gettysburg tour. I do a tour for abolitionist tour for Juneteenth. So because there's so many tour guides and so many tours, I don't get to do the more crazier stuff, except until October comes around and we have our soul crawl tours, which are the nighttime flashlight macabre themed tours for the Halloween season.
Pay attention, audiences, macabre themed tours.
I love those. I love those tours because we get to talk about the crazy stuff that actually happened, actual real history that is more almost unbelievable than actual fiction.
What would be now, I'm not asking you to give away all the tour secrets, but give us a little bit of a taste of what's something that we might find surprising on that tour.
Well, we have a gentleman who was a Civil War veteran, and years later he decided he didn't want to live anymore. So he went to the cemetery, the plot where his family is buried. He stood where he will be buried and committed suicide on the spot where he would be buried, and he was buried there.
Well, that's grim.
It's very grim. So he's the only person buried in Laurel Hill who's actually buried the exact spot where he died. Or stories like that, or we also have another one where, we have several Titanic victims there and also Titanic survivors. And we do have a woman who was very rich. She married into a rich family and her husband passed away, implored her to get a will. She never did. She died with the money. And for the next 25 years, thousands of people tried to claim her will, to the point where they wanted to exhume her body to see if the will was buried in there.
Oh, that's crazy. So that had to have been uncomfortable. You had people seeking to dig the poor lady up.
Well, the Laurel Hill actually had to post a guard at the gravesite. In fact, there was a picture in the newspaper, Contemporary Time in the newspapers, of the guard actually sitting at the gravesite to make sure people don't come and try to dig this woman up.
Oh, that's horrific. Well, they do say money changes people, so it does definitely. So I know that Russ and I have been friends for, oh gosh, a while. And of course, the Civil War is a huge part about. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and we met through Find a Grave, a website that at the time was a smaller version than what you find now.
Yeah.
And Russ was an admin. And of course, you were the go-to for Civil War. One of the things I always thought interesting, and I had no idea if this is a rule, just about everybody I know who has a vested interest in Civil War history is also kooky about baseball. And I think that would be accurate. I'm not sure Ken Burns, look, he went and did it.
He did both.
Yes, exactly. This is what I'm saying. So I know that you have a particular affinity for something called the dead ball era, which is a phrase I hadn't heard till I met you. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with dead ball.
Well, the dead ball era was the time before 1920s, early 1920s, when they changed the composition of the baseball. Before that, it was bigger, thicker, heavier, and a lot harder to hit the ball out of the ballpark. In fact, a majority of home runs in the dead ball era were, we'd call inside the park home runs. They weren't socked out of the park. And then, of course, they changed the ball, and then this crazy guy came along who was a pitcher for the Red Sox, got traded to the Yankees, and he smashed more home runs than all the other teams combined in 1 year.
He sounds like he has a cursed existence.
Exactly, yes.
And to be fair, my personal geographic origins I'm from Bristol, Rhode Island. So I do come from Red Sox country. And the gentleman you are speaking of, who was once a Red Sox and then was traded to the Yankees, is
Babe Ruth himself.
And it is the basis of the original 87 year, was it 82 or whatever, 80 something year drought.
Curse of the Bambino.
Right, the curse of the Bambino, and that was the thing. But there's a lot of people buried in and around historical cemeteries that have a very deep connection to the early phases of baseball. Yes.
Yes, there are. In fact, in Laurel Hill itself, now because I'm a tour guide at Laurel Hill, I can focus it, but I do historical research in the entire Philadelphia area, so I can speak to other cemeteries too. But in Laurel Hill Cemetery itself, the person who threw the very first pitch in the National League in April 1876 is buried there. A pitcher named Alonzo Knight. And story goes is that the precursor to the National League, which obviously still exists today, was the National Association, and that was full of corruption and problems. So they got rid of that and reformed the teams and reformed the league as a National League. And there was a slate of 8 teams. And in April 1876, there were supposed to be 8 teams debuting. Well, 7 got rained out. The only one that did get rained out was Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Athletics, which isn't the same athletics as today. It's an entirely different team. So Alonzo Knight threw the very first pitch in the National League, and he's buried unmarked in Laurel Hill Cemetery. Now, we at Laurel Hill have been trying for years to see if anybody's interested to come along and put a grave marker, and as of yet, that's not happened, but eventually somebody will.
Well, let's, maybe somewhere out there, somebody will hear this who might be from any kind of a sports preservation group. The historical value of something like that would be immeasurable. I don't think it would be fair to, while we're all hopefully going to be listening from different places, to mention Philadelphia sports, and Laurel Hill without talking about some of your more illustrious, more recent inhabitants of Laurel Hill.
Mr. Harry Callis.
Correct.
Harry Callis, yes. Harry Callis is interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery. Sorry. When Harry Callis passed away in April 2009, his family wanted him to be buried somewhere where there's access to the people. Anybody who's a Philadelphia fan grew up in that area. I definitely grew up with listening to Harry Callis, listening to Phillies. And when they wanted to find some place to inter him, because he had no plans, they picked Laurel Hill Cemetery because they knew Laurel Hill Cemetery was a destination spot, had a lot of programs, a lot of people come to visit it, even just to come visit and walk around the grounds and picnic in the grounds or jog in the grounds. So we're kind of surprised that they picked Laurel Hill Cemetery, and that's where Harry Callis is buried today, under a depiction of the microphone that he would speak into.
Yes, it's actually a very stunning monument. I recommend if you're going to do a little cemetery tourist stuff. That is a gorgeous spot also because that's right. That's just looking over the river, is it not?
Yes,
Yeah,
prime
it's just a
location.
really. I always notice from General Meade, I can see kind of down on top of it from that spot there. And for those who aren't familiar, Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia is massive. It is a garden cemetery, and it harkens back to the time of cemeteries like Swan Point in Providence. Some of your cemeteries out in New England that are garden cemeteries. They were constructed, they were conceived and planned to be very picturesque, to have a lot of vegetation. There's that. What's the one? Is it Riverview that's up in Trenton? That also is a lovely
Riverview's
garden.
in Trenton. Yes,
Yeah,
Riverview,
that's
Trenton, right off the river. That's why it's called Riverview. You can see it right at the river.
now. I think it's fair because I can't lie. I was going to say you've been to thousands of cemeteries, dude. You've been to thousands of cemeteries with me.
I have actually.
And so I'm going to say you've been to millions of cemeteries. I think at this point you could possibly extrapolate that because no offense, Russ, but you ain't a kid anymore. So you've been doing this a while. And which favorite cemetery besides Laurel Hill? We're gonna kind of give you that. We're gonna give you that one. What are some of your favorites?
It's funny because you have the big ones that are great, like Woodlawn in the Bronx, of course, in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. To the big massive ones there. In fact, Greenwood and Woodlawn are far bigger than Laurel Hill, actually.
Would it
be
of course,
there's Mount Auburn. Was that?
Oh, so I'm sorry. I was going to say, would it be fair to say that most people, whether they're aware of it or not, have actually seen pieces of Greenwood and Woodlawn when they watch movies? Because those are very, very typically used as settings for New York cemeteries.
And Cypress Hill and cemeteries in Brooklyn as well,
wow.
Where Jackie Robinson is buried. That's, in fact, which movie I was watching the other day. I think, the very first Spider-Man movie that had, what's his name, Tobey Maguire. Mm-hmm. That was filmed in Cypress Hill. And I looked at that, I'm like, wait a minute, is that Cypress Hill? I recognize it right away. But I looked up on IMDb, and yes, that's where it's filmed. So if you see most cemeteries, here's a little aside, most cemeteries you see in movies, unless you're on site, they are not real cemeteries. They are fake cemeteries from lots, etc. in California, for the in Hollywood area. But occasionally they get to film in other real cemeteries too, and that was one of them.
Sure. And you were mentioning Mount Auburn.
Mount Auburn up in Cambridge, which was the very first garden cemetery.
Indeed.
Laurel Hill Cemetery was the second. Cambridge was Mount Auburn in Cambridge was the first.
And bringing up the third, thank you very much, Providence, Rhode Island, we have Swan Point.
Swan Point, yes.
So I have a dear friend who I'm hoping will join us that has a family legacy at Swan Point, where their dad ran the crematorium, and they played in the chapel for many, many years and is still involved there. So I'm hoping he's going to join us for a future episode as well. So we've got, speaking of movies and cemeteries, and of course you have those cemeteries in Brooklyn that everybody's familiar with. I think a lot of people have seen Laurel Hill too, because hasn't there a cemetery stone in Laurel Hill that is a cenotaph for a non-existent person?
Well, what I call it is, it's the person who is on the gravestone is the most famous person who never existed, who's not buried there.
And who would that be?
That would be Adrian Balboa.
Okay.
From the Rocky movies. When they revived all the sequels afterwards, and they started with the movie Rocky Balboa. By that time, Adrian had been passed away, so Stallone wanted to show some scenes of Rocky at her grave, and they picked Laurel Hill Cemetery. Now, and along with a lot of cemeteries that you see in movies are fake cemeteries, a lot of gravestones you see are obviously fake gravestones. In fact, they're props, as in they are styrofoam. That's a standard practice to make a fake gravestone. And when they were creating the gravestone for the movie Rocky Balboa for Adrian to be in Laurel Hill Cemetery, Stallone looked at it and said, this didn't work right. So he actually commissioned and paid for himself an actual gravestone for Adrian Balboa, which they used in the movie. And after the movie was finished, they donated it to Laurel Hill Cemetery, and Stallone actually he endowed the plot that it was the actual plot of people buried there for perpetual care.
Oh, that's a class move.
It was a very class move. Very cool. Very good of him. And so the stone was actually moved to the side near the gatehouse and is now an attraction in Laurel Hill Cemetery. So you can go by and see Adrian Balboa's gravestone. And it's been joined in the last couple of years by Paulie's gravestone, because for the Creed movies, Paulie was passed away as well. So they
okay. So you're just collecting props over there of actual gravestones.
And when they film successive movies, they move the prop gravestone from its place of display near the gatehouse at the entrance back to the plot, because the plot's in the south part of the cemetery. It's actually pretty far a walk, and then they bring it back again. So they've done that 3 times already for the 2 Creed movies, and I believe Adrian Balboa.
Oh, that's wild. Yeah. I think that a lot of folks remember that scene in the film. And I'm not making any Rocky and Adrian jokes. It's a little too easy. Yeah. And then I'm Rocky, but and all that good stuff. So we've got lots of Civil War history at Laurel Hill. Recently, had the pleasure of joining you and the rest of the crew down there for the General Meade toast, and it's a beautiful, beautiful event on the New Year's Eve day. And folks will go ahead and have a champagne toast at General Meade's graveside, which this year wasn't so bad because the weather was fairly cooperative. It was damn near.
It really was.
It was like in the 50s, which was great because one year we went and it was like -25.
It was really cold. In fact,
it was really cold.
We had a quick toast at his grave, then we all piled into the other building for Laurel Hill Cemetery. We're all stuffed in there.
Now there's also some Harry Callis memorabilia on site that can be viewed, and there's a gift shop as well. So there's lots of cool stuff that's going on. Mm-hmm. What happened with the Yahoos? How many Yahoo graves? For those who don't know, the 23rd New Jersey, are they infantry?
Yes.
23rd New Jersey Infantry Unit of the Civil War was nicknamed the Yahoos, and they were from Burlington County primarily. And Russ, how many of them are there, and how many grave sites have you tagged?
It's the 23rd New Jersey Volunteer Infantry was a Civil War unit from basically Burlington County, New Jersey, and it was a 7-month regiment. So it was enlisted for a 7-month time period, and I became very interested in them because I was living in Burlington, New Jersey at the time, and their first company was from Burlington, New Jersey. So they became my favorite regiment in the Civil War. And there was over 1,000 men in the regiment, and I've tracked down 702 of their grave sites, and I've documented on Find a Grave.
So fair to say just about 2/3 so far?
Pretty much, yeah.
Almost. We'd never trust my math. That's well documented not to do that. Well, that's a crazy interest. I mean, so it was just when you were living in Burlington. Has the Civil War always been a thing with you, or no?
It really has. It has been a thing with me ever since. My grandfather told us when I was real young that we were related to a Civil War general. Granville Mellon Dodge is the general's name. And I was all proud that, hey, my Civil War ancestor was a general. So that got me into more Civil War. I got a hold of, when I was 11, 12 years old, of a book called the Illustrated History of the Civil War by Bruce Catton. And of course, I found out later in life that I am related to that general, but extremely, extremely, extremely distantly. He was not a direct general, not a direct descendant. So my grandfather led me astray in one way, but got me in the path of Civil War. And actually, that Civil War interest also got me into the cemetery interest, because when I was about 10, 11 years old, the school I was going to, I was able to walk home from there. And this was in Salem, New Jersey, where I grew up. And I would walk sometimes through this churchyard. And I kind of walk through the churchyard, and then I'd see the graves, and I'd look at the dates in the graves and go, oh my gosh, this person lived during the Civil War. This person could have voted for Abraham Lincoln. This person could have voted against Abraham Lincoln, or this person could have protested that, being that they were a woman or they were black, they couldn't have a chance to vote for Abraham Lincoln. So I was able to connect the history with the gravestones and the people buried there. And the Civil War history got me into my cemetery enthusiasm, because I got to learn about find out the buried history in the cemeteries, and also it offshooted my sort of macabre interest too, because I was always interested in horror movies, etc., like that as well. So it's a well-rounded
You're a bit grim, are you, Russ? You're a little grim.
A little grim, possibly.
A little grim.
So it all goes together.
It's true. No, I mean, I always like to ask people about what I call the seminal moment when you become a death nerd. But in this case, when you make the connection, and I think there are some people that will make this connection deeper than others, that every stone is a story.
Yes, every stone is a story, and I've kind of figured that out when I was walking through these gravestones. It's like, who are these people? Exactly. What do they do? What are their stories behind it? Because the gravestones is the ending of the story, so it's you work way back to find the beginning and the middle. By the way, you know that you were in that cemetery at one point.
Which cemetery?
St. John's Churchyard in Salem. That's where we encountered the wild turkey.
Oh my goodness gracious. Yes. And he's not talking about the beverage, although it is tasty. He is talking about the fact that I came around. I want to say there was we're out, and it's a fairly rural area, more or less. I mean, Salem, New Jersey, that's Cumberland County in it.
It's Salem County, actually.
Salem County. Sorry, I'm from Rhode Island. I just lived here now. So, there was a long, low, wide stone, and I walked around the other side of it. And on the other side, jumping Judas, this thing was huge. That was like, a pterodactyl on the other side of this thing. And I was mincing about, screaming, bird of prey, because I don't know, you ever look at the feet on a turkey? I don't want that. I don't want to meet the business end of that thing. But I do remember, yes, there was, I am somewhat hazardous yet enthusiastic in a cemetery between large birds of prey, sending me shrieking in the other direction, walking through a spider web, which I think we can all agree turns us into ninjas. And then, gopher holes. I'm something of a small disaster. However, it does not dampen my enjoyment of such things. But speaking of going back to the Civil War, and there's lots of cemetery preservation in general is a difficult subject because there's so many cemeteries that are falling by the wayside. I think that people being interested in genealogy and the way Find a Grave from small start to big finish got more people interested in the plight of cemeteries themselves. I think that's one huge thing. For those who aren't familiar, a website named Find a Grave many moons ago started off as a small sort of graveyard touristy kind of site where famous people were buried. And it quite literally snowballed, slow at first, and then it took a massive turn to where it is the largest internet database of transcribed cemeteries, I believe, at this point.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
And it's now currently under the umbrella of ancestry.com.
Yes, it is. They're still keeping it free as far as I know.
Right. But the Find a Grave is absolutely huge. And a lot of people, because of the ancestry angle, are a little bit more aware of smaller abandoned cemeteries. It kind of brings people into the neighborhoods, at least virtually, to see what the fate of some of this history. I think that in general, that's good. But this is controversial to some. Russ and I are friends, so we're not going to, even if we have a difference of opinion, this isn't going to make or break us. But I got to say to folks, there's a lot of controversy right now, talking about the Civil War, talking about monuments, talking about historical preservation. It is hot and bothered as far as things like one example that I saw relatively recently. I actually was that they removed the General Lee statue from the Lee Circle in New Orleans. And similarly, all over places through, I think it's not necessarily exclusively the South, but I think it's related to a lot of the Confederate monuments are being removed. Right. And I think there's a lot to say about it. And there's a lot to say about preservation. There's a lot to say about teaching moments. What say you? What do you think about all that?
Well, there's a difference between preserving a statue that is in a public square that was placed most of the times implicitly to perpetuate the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, where the Confederates were a noble effort to preserve rights when in fact they were an effort to create a sovereign nation where the chattel slavery of African Americans would be enshrined in perpetuity. You know what I mean? For all time. How's that for a good word? Yes. And their laws and customs. So that's the lost cause narrative. There's a big difference between doing that and preserving the grave sites of people who have passed on before, and at least showing them, if not respect to where they are, respect for the cemetery itself. So, I mean, I don't have an issue with statues of Robert E. Lee coming down, et cetera, like that, because they were put up anyway in the first place for intimidation factors and for perpetuation of white supremacy. So I haven't had an issue with that. And statues really are, people say that you're tearing down history. Well, statues aren't history. Statues are commemoration. And if you're commemorating somebody who basically were decided to side for the side that was going to rend the nation in two and create and perpetuate slavery, then that's not somebody you can really commemorate.
Makes sense. I mean, in a place like, let's say, Gettysburg, where you have, it's pretty egalitarian there because you're going to have, it's commemorating all of the units from all sides and all of the events, good, bad, and otherwise. So do you think places like that are going to be relatively, because those aren't some, although there is a very large cemetery at Gettysburg, there's also, monuments in and throughout the battlefield. And I think in a lot of other battlefields from a similar, they're all in trust and they're all parks now, and they are marked similarly with unit markers and things like that. Do you think things like that are going to probably not change too much?
I don't think it's going to change. I think that that's a place like a battlefield, like a national battlefield, is a place where there is an ability to tell more of the history than a statue would be in a public square. So you have interpreters, you have people going there for the history itself.
You can change the narrative too.
You can actually change the narrative. You can add to the narrative. You can add to the narrative that why is this Confederate monument here? And you can say, what they fought for. There's no, even though the monument itself says they fought for their state's rights, you have people say the state rights to keep people enslaved. You can interpret that. You don't really have that interpretation from a statue that's standing in a public square. So I think that there actually will be turned from something maybe divisive into something that, we can tell more of the story and get more complete history why they're there. And the fact that they say something that they differently mean that can be interpreted by both more signage and also the tour guides and literature. So I think the national parks, the battlefields will stay the same. And in fact, they'll be a very good tool for actually teaching the full history, not just the history that's displayed on the monument itself.
Well, the monuments are disappearing. I don't know where they're going entirely. I know some of them are probably going into storage, and some of them are probably going to. Are any of them going to like universities, or are they going? Where are they going?
Well, it depends.
This is a big statue. Where did that go?
I know that the Lee statue that was taken down was going to be melted down to make into another statue. Several other statues are going into museums. Other statues are going onto private property.
Gotcha.
And other statues are just remain in storage. Like I know that there is a statue in Baltimore of Chief Justice Roger Taney, the person who had the ruling for the Dred Scott ruling, which is one of the worst humanitarian rulings in American judicial history.
Indeed.
However, he was a governor of Maryland, and also he was a Baltimorean in that area, and he was a chief justice. So at some time after the Civil War, they made a statue for him. Well, that was taken down. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think that's going to remain in storage until somebody decides to just trash it. So, which I'm okay with that too.
What about your fella there in Philly? A little bit later than the Civil War, did they take him down, or is he still standing up? The mayor, the statue of the mayor.
Oh, Frank Rizzo.
That's
contemporary. There are people today who are bitter from Frank Rizzo, and there's people today who laud Frank Rizzo. That's really to me, that's really, you can make an argument for and against it, and whatever side you're on. I think that if it's divisive, there's some other way to honor Frank Rizzo if that's what you want to do. I wouldn't have a statue right there. So,
they want to take Columbus out too.
They do want to take Columbus out, and there's also arguments for and against that. Now, the thing is that the Columbus statues were placed there not to specifically laud Columbus, but what is the idea of adventure and exploration and it's cultural expansion. And it really was placed in the 1800s for more like a pride type of thing for the people that were doing, less to be, hey, Columbus was a fantastic person. So I think that's
not if you ask my mom.
Yeah, Yeah, especially Italians.
And I should note that my mom is Portuguese and has told us on more than one occasion that we're direct descendants from Miguel de Cortreal, a Portuguese explorer literally no one has heard of. And he is noted by almost no one for discovering Dighton Rock, which is allegedly supposed to predate the Plymouth Mayflower expansion. And it's often been said in my house growing up, because I have a Portuguese parent and I had an Italian parent, Sicilian, actually. He would have not appreciate that I said he was Italian, and that Columbus would not have been able to find his way to this country without his Portuguese navigation crew, and that the Spanish Armada was basically neither, and without the the ace navigation of Portugal, then there wouldn't have been any discovery. Yada yada yada. Every first Monday in October, there was a civil war in our own house. And it got ugly because my mom, it basically culminated to some Portuguese explorer you can't find your way home from the Brighton Street Bridge. But that notwithstanding, there are a lot of monuments, especially when you get up toward in New England, when you're getting up toward Rhode Island. We have a Portuguese explorer. There are monuments that celebrate not necessarily the individual explorers, but celebrate, as you said, the spirit of exploration, the spirit of exploration, of setting off into far and amazing new lands and taking the indigenous people and shoving them off their private property.
Right.
So that's not. I can see, I can see both sides of all of these issues. I hate to say that sounds so wishy-washy, like I'm trying to play the middle, but it's the truth. I can argue either side in most cases. Like,
there are nuances, arguments for both sides.
There really are. And neither side, I don't think has I don't think there's more merit than other. I think it just depends on where your moral compass points. Yeah. And they're both meritorious arguments. I think that, people often bring up some of the more grim and horrible leftovers of history that one can find in Europe, and that they're still there and you can still tour them. And the European attitude, more or less, is that they're open and accessible and they're not torn down, so that, lest we forget history, we repeat it.
Right. And like when you get a nuanced argument, that takes away a lot of the emotion behind the argument. So if you take away a lot of the emotion, you get more nuanced argument. You have a better idea of what you're for or against, and you have a better idea of what maybe the proper course for that is. And you have more satisfaction that, we're doing the right thing for this. So the simple arguments that go to a lot of this going back and forth, it's really don't have any nuance to it. Yeah,
it's got to be case by case, really, because
it really is
some cases that it's you get to a point where you're like, oh, okay, all right, well, no, I get it, but then otherwise you say, oh God, why was that still there?
It behooves people make an argument to try to find some of the nuance too. Because if you're just simply saying this person is a racist, tear it down. This person is a terrible person, tear it down. We get a nuanced argument, and then if you find out maybe this person is as bad as you may have thought, or you said, yes, this person is as bad as we thought. Here it is. Here's the rational reason for taking this down. So it's really get more information and more nuanced argument. You can actually do a better job of deciding what to do with these things.
Now, going back to the blue and the gray, the North and the South, if I'm not mistaken, I don't recall how close they were in age, and I know you're able to tell me. Grant and Lee were relatively close. Did they go to West Point together?
No, Grant, I think graduated in 1843, 1844. I can't have it off my head right now, but Lee graduated in 1829. So there was a fair age difference then. Yeah, there was.
I was understood that they actually regarded each other quite well.
They did. They regarded each other well, but remember, they had fought against each other for a good period of time, and they thought each other were the adversaries to each other, and of course the time period of civility and honor between people like that, maybe they felt each other. They didn't have really animosity to each other, and they had encountered each other briefly in Mexican War, but Lee was a much higher officer than Grant was during the war as well. So
that would stand because of the age. I didn't realize the age difference was that broad.
Yeah, there was Lee had already had a very long career before the Civil War, and Grant had a career. Then he had left. And he really struggled until the war actually came, and he uses his contacts to become an officer and he rose right from there. So yeah, so Grant was in his 40s and Lee was in his late 50s, early 60s.
Oh, okay. That used to sound old to me. It doesn't anymore.
Yeah, I know. Now that I'm in my mid 50s, it's like that's not as old as I thought it was.
Yeah, remember when that seemed really, really old? But look at so there's a lot of that. Well, that they, if I'm not mistaken, the casualty, because all of the casualties were Americans of the Civil War. Is that statistic still the most outstanding American casualty outside of maybe COVID-19?
There was always a narrative for decades that like 600,000 died in the Civil War on both sides. They're all Americans, but people had gone back in the last 10 years to kind of recalculate it, and there's actually an estimated over 700,000.
Wow.
And it really came down to 2% of the American population.
That's crazy.
In the Civil War. Yeah. 2%.
That would be, now, if you think about how many people that is now today, because what's the population of the United States?
About 360 million, I think.
I wasn't prepared for this. so then we're talking about how many people then? He said 2%?
2% of 360 million. So that's a couple million. It's millions there.
Yeah, so, it's millions and millions, and that's crazy. That's 2% of the population is a huge number, and a lot of that wasn't just firepower. There was a lot of disease and pestilence.
Yeah, more disease killed soldiers than bullets and cannonballs, because modern medicine wasn't what it was even 10 years afterwards. We're 10 years behind Louis Pasteur. With the germ theory and pasteurization and all that. So,
that was still, though, I've heard from more than one source that was kind of the inception. Like that's when we were starting. That was one of the good things that came out of that, was there was enough experience through trying to heal people and trying to keep people well. They learned, unfortunately, in some cases, what didn't work. And that helped along some of that research, because it was shortly after the Civil War that the inception of germ theory is I guess historically lauded. So there's a lot going on. You always want to say, and for what? Without the political aspect of it, I mean, there was two sides that fought. One side won, one side didn't. Besides the tenets of what each side was fighting for, I think economically that was kind of a slam dunk. I think the way that economically it wasn't going to go, it wasn't going to go any way than the way it went.
No.
Between supply lines and that's also, we're creeping into the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in that time. So you have the ability to not only make supplies, but make them quicker, faster. You're taking raw materials and you're able to churn out things. And so, when you start cutting off lines of supply, that's when everybody's got to become real independent real quick. And that doesn't always work for every society. Go ahead.
Well, I say the Civil War is probably it was the best documented medically conflict in human history up to that point, because it was such a massive amount of participants. And we had in America at that time period, we had for 30 years beforehand, a huge boon in medical science and medical practitioners. So you had a lot of doctors who were well-trained, had 50 years beyond what I say the other biggest war that the century, the Napoleonic Wars, had in terms of medical advancement. And they documented it very, very well. There was medical journals, medical science societies, academies. So we're talking about the beginning of modern science. Modern medical science really started in the Civil War because of all the documentation by all the medical personnel who did what they could and said what worked and what didn't work. And they had it submitted, printed, and other doctors along could actually read about it, learn it, and expound it without actually having experienced the war itself.
And that's invaluable, because that just is the way it was an information share that provided education, like you said, for currently, oddly enough, Camden, New Jersey teaching hospital in Camden, New Jersey is doing exactly the same thing with gunshots when they're training the U.S. Army, because unfortunately, Camden has a lot of gun violence, yep. And this very large, very prominent hospital in Camden, New Jersey now has a program with the U.S. Army where we are training combat medics.
Yeah,
and it's amazing that something good can come out of it, because it all seems pretty dismal as far as that's concerned. So going back to graveyards and talking a little bit, you made me think of this when we were talking about the medical the information from casualties being medical. There was a time, of course, back in more so in Europe, I'd like to think, where cadavers for medical research were often obtained via nefarious sources. Let's say
the resurrectionists. And let me point out that Darker Art Studio does not condone resurrectionism, does not participate in any sort of grave robbing. We abide by the Native American Cemeteries Act, and everything is a retired medical specimen. This has been a public service announcement. Anyway, so don't dig up graves.
Don't dig up graves, and it's but one of the things that I love to talk about is when people go into a historic cemetery, be it in the United States or in Europe, they see some things that appeared to have been there's a lot of misconceptions out there, let's say.
Yes,
for example, sometimes folks might see a cage, what appears to be a wrought iron cage over the size of where a coffin would go, sticking up out of the ground. So you're walking along, minding your own business, and here's a wrought iron cage like a dome over a length of grave. And most people are convinced it's actually called a mort safe. There is a company that made them, and a mort safe, and most folks are convinced. What do you hear when you talk about mort safes? Because we are people that talk about.
It's funny because mort safes are obviously far more European than America, but there are some in America. People ask that, and they basically say it's to keep the undead from coming out of the grave. That's what that's what the belief that people see that first, or they've heard. It's to keep that, or vampires from coming out of the grave after the dead has been killed by a vampire 3 days later. So that's the popular notion often about these mort safes.
So let's clear that one up. So I guess we could say that myth number one is to keep whatever is underneath it in.
Exactly. Myth number one,
busted, because it's actually the opposite. It's to keep folks out. It is to keep folks out. It's also to keep occasionally in some areas where things might be a little too fresh. It'll keep animals out as well, because you don't want Fido to go and dig up Uncle Henry. So we got to be careful with that. But so that's one thing. So if you ever see a cage type structure on a European or American cemetery on the ground, it is not to hold in vampires. It is to keep grave robbers and other nuisances, animals, vermins, out of the grave. So that's
exactly. Yep.
And one of the other, and this one actually sounds like it shouldn't be true, but it is deliciously true, and I do love it. A lot of people may go into, and these were popular coming into the Victorian era, a little bit after that. There are some monuments that at a glance do appear to be made of stone until you get up on top of them and you actually knock on them and you find out that they're made of metal.
Yes, made of zinc, to
Correct.
be exact.
To be known among death nerds as zinkers.
Zinkers.
And the greatest rumor I heard about zinkers, and as far as I know, this is actually true, is that zinc monuments, those front plates, were taken off in some of them that had nice big bases, and that was a great place to hide your bootleg booze. well, let me tell you. I'm gonna say I can't say that I could prove or disprove that, but it sounds like a good idea to me.
Well, a good portion of the what we call zinkers, which are zinc wrought iron grave markers, weren't big enough to hide anything in it. And they originated in Bridgeport, Connecticut. There was a company who decided that they could corner the market on these markers that are supposed to last. Since they're metal, they're not going to deteriorate. So any zinker you wanted, you ordered it from a catalog and they mailed it to you. And it didn't catch on as much as they had hoped.
So if you think it's weird that Amazon can bring you groceries, there was a time you could get your gravestone in the mail.
You can get it in the mail. You can order from a catalog from this company in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And was cost prohibitive to get really big ones. That's why most Zinkers are relatively small, although you can get massive ones. In fact, Laurel Hill has probably the biggest Zinker I've ever seen in my life. It's for these two people who were spiritualists.
Mm-hmm.
And it has everything that you ever wanted on there, but most Zinkers are relatively small. So I'm sure that you can knock a panel out and put booze in there, but that wasn't a specific reason why you.
Oh, not specific, but one hell of a side use.
I'm sure at some point during the 1920s, somebody decided that's a great place to put it on, and then they put them there.
I gotta tell you, man, I've been up close and personal with more than my share of Zinkers, and I could put at least 4 growlers in every one of them.
A couple of them.
I could put.
They're big enough ones that you could do that.
Yeah, you could put a couple of cases of hooch in there. It could happen. It's easy enough to do. But that's now I would be remiss, and I think I'm going to disappoint a lot of people if I don't. The first thing that when folks find out that I have a lot of time in the cemeteries, via cemetery preservation, being a trustee of a cemetery, that kind of thing, and having gone through lots of cemeteries with you, and for trying to get some of them cataloged and photographed and all that good stuff. So safe to say we've trounced a few boneyards, as have many. And the first thing anyone ever says to me is, "Oh my goodness, that's so creepy. You must see ghosts all the time." Do people say that to you?
People do tell me that, and I tell them that I've been to thousands of cemeteries, and now it's up to 29 states.
Wow.
I've never seen anything that could be unexplained. That could be that I had a hard time explaining. There's always some sort of explanation of anything that goes on in a cemetery, even if at a cemetery at night, which I don't go often at night. Why? Because it's dangerous. Why? You trip on stuff.
Well, that's true.
There's plenty of stuff to trip on, hurt yourself in a cemetery at night.
I trip on
nothing's reaching out. No hands are coming out, but
well, those gopher holes, that struggle's real. But I have never personally had a paranormal experience in a cemetery. I think the most outside of the norm experience I ever had in a cemetery was in Laurel Hill when the Dead Milkmen played against the mausoleum. That should be noted too, that there's a lot of interesting events like that with concerts and shows. But yeah, we got to see the Dead Milkmen play.
Yeah, and they play every other year at Laurel Hill Cemetery because they're from Manayunk, right down the road in Philadelphia.
So. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, well, all the punk rock girls out there gotta get it together and see them at Laurel Hill. But yeah, I think that would be the first question, because people find them creepy. I don't personally find cemeteries creepy.
No,
I find them very, very relaxing, and they're often beautiful. They're usually fascinating, because there's lots of different, like we said, every stone is a story. Right. So I tend to not have. If there's paranormal experiences happening in the cemetery, I'm oblivious to them.
I know they're happening to me, so I guess they don't like me because I never experienced anything paranormal in the cemetery at all. Everything I experience is normal.
Well, I've known you almost the high side of 20 years. I gotta say, I could see why they'd avoid you. It's all right.
I'm okay with that. Just let me walk to the cemetery, record it, and get all the stories down. Don't bother me. Don't pull my hair or anything like that.
Hey, there you have it, folks. Don't pull Russ's hair. He just doesn't like it. But it's one of those things, though. It's I think a lot of people I think that's getting to be more of an antiquated notion, because I do notice that I see a lot of people enjoying cemeteries, especially the more picturesque, like Laurel Hill, the more park like. I see people running. I see people with properly leashed and cleaned up after pets. Russ will tell you, I had a dog with me in the cemetery for a long time. Yeah. I had my sidekick Booch, has been in several cemeteries in many states, and worked with me when I did preservation work all over New England and some of Jersey. So yeah, it's I think we're getting away from the cemeteries are creepy thing, or do you think people still get? Because remember when you used to get side eye if you told somebody that
Oh, absolutely.
They'd look at you and go, "What, are you weird?"
Yeah.
Well, maybe not for you, because I am from New England, so it'd be weird. But you're weird.
Garden cemeteries were created as a place for people to come, not just to pay respects to the past. They're dead. They were actually the very first open spaces public open spaces in America, outside of the small town green, which a lot of New England cities formed around.
We call them the common.
So the common. That's
the common.
So
it's one in my town. I don't even live in Boston. I live in I'm from a small town named Bristol, and we have Bristol Common. So you have your common.
So these cemeteries were encouraged to come and people picnic and spend time there and just commune with nature and get the people together. It was supposed to celebrate life and wasn't there to be mournful of the dead. And Laurel Hill Cemetery specifically, they had a problem as they got more popular of people coming in and having horse races in the cemetery itself. Young men racing horses in the cemetery.
I want to try that.
Yeah, well, to the point where they had to restrict in the 1840s on Sundays, only lot holders with a ticket come in and visit.
Oh, wow.
That was the popular day to come and ride horses around in the cemetery.
So it got exclusionary real quick.
Well, they didn't discourage people from coming in there, but it was like, all right, you're taking a little bit too much. So yeah, people were treating the cemeteries as parkland, which, that was meant to be a park for them. But, obviously at some point somebody took it a little too far, but that didn't last that long. And, people still use cemeteries today as a place to walk around, picnic, just be by yourself, be quiet, be an open space.
Very meditative. There's now Laurel Hill has programs with yoga actually at the cemetery.
Yes, they do.
And that's I think pretty cool. I know we keep bringing up Laurel Hill, but they just have so many cool things. And I if you're not in the local Philadelphia area, please, if you're interested in these types of programs, there's a lot of larger, very unusual historic cemeteries all over the country that have similar programs and that have. So if you can always have a look at what's happening in your area, because I think there's been a little bit of a renaissance. Because I think I hate to say it because I'll be the first one to tell you there was a time I rolled my eyes in pain at this. It's the genealogists. The genealogists, which used to be the bane of every cemetery professional because they were relentless and occasionally an invasive species. However, the genealogists, I owe you all a supreme apology because I think that the movement of the who do we think we are, the expansion of ancestry.com. I think that all of these types of things where people are suddenly researching their roots, the availability of more records online so that people can do it with blessedly little effort. I think that is starting to bring a resurgence of reverence, interest, and curiosity, and not so much the morbid kind for cemeteries.
Well, if you hear of a cemetery that's run down, you go, oh, that's awful. But you hear a cemetery run down and, oh, my great-great-grandfather's buried there. Now it's personal. And then maybe you'll do what you can to start an effort to get the cemetery cleaned up, documented, and preserved for all time, which is really what anybody who's into cemeteries, history, preservation, that's really our goal, is to have the cemeteries preserved for all time, the cemetery to be dignified for all time, and to be documented for all time so people can, so the stories that are there are well known or can be found out and can be explored and can be enjoyed.
I think we go right back to it. Every stone's a story.
Every stone is a story, yes.
Every stone is a story. We're getting ready to wrap up, but before we do, you said how many? 29 states, cemeteries in 29
states, yes.
29 states.
And counting.
I got to ask, because you've been to, I said 1 million, and that might be slightly exaggerated.
A little bit too much.
But I think it's only slight, really. I do. But you've been to some, give me some cemeteries on your bucket list. You got to have some that are still out there, because when you get
definitely some. Well, that's a good question. It's on areas that I have been to. Like, I've never been to California. I know you have, but I've never been to California. Greenwood in San Diego is a very historical. Holy Cross in Colma, California. Definitely Presidio, the National Cemetery there, because there are lots of Civil War figures buried in the Presidio. Go up to Washington State, Seattle.
Renton.
I think with Shelley.
Go to Renton.
Renton, of course, see Jimi Hendrix, but
and you know who else is in the same? I don't know if it's in the same exact cemetery or if it's like Laurel Hill, it's split in and it's on the other side. Brandon Lee as well.
Oh yeah, because both Bruce and Brandon are buried next to each other.
Correct. Well, close enough.
The Lee's area.
In the sort of kind of similar area. But so the West Coast. How about Europe? What do you think? Père Lachaise?
Oh, definitely. I've never been to Europe. Père Lachaise, of course, and not just for Jim Morrison. There's plenty of others there. In fact, there are connections between Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, where I'm a tour guide, and Père Lachaise. There's people buried there in Père Lachaise that have cenotaphs in Laurel Hill Cemetery. Highgate in
Karl
London.
Marx. Karl Marx is in Highgate. That's in
East
London.
and West, Putney Vale, Westminster Abbey.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, the Picpus Cemetery in Paris, where Lafayette's buried. Places like that,
There's always more to discover.
There's always more to discover. They're not going anywhere. Knock on wood. So they'll be there at some point.
Well, I don't know. In Europe, they do sometimes.
They do. Yes.
Funny. That's just occasionally.
Got to pay your rent.
Yep. They are leased lots in many European cemeteries, and if you don't pay your rent, well, you don't pay your rent.
Well, they just had a big thing about Jim Morrison a couple of years ago, that the rent was due, and they were worried they're going to take Jim Morrison, cremate him, and put his ashes somewhere. So somebody stepped up and paid his rent in perpetuity. Hey, got the word in.
Well, it did, and I think they wanted him. If I recall, they wanted him out of there. There's mixed feelings because of the draw.
Yeah.
But also in Père Lachaise, just off the top of my head, I mean, there's been musicians and playwrights and artists in Père Lachaise for centuries. I think Bizet and Chopin.
If you're in Civil War history, Judah Benjamin, who was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy, is buried there. He absconded to there after the Civil War. Oscar Wilde is buried there. So plenty of non-French people buried there as well.
Well, I think there's lots of Americans buried overseas.
Yes,
and there's something to be said for in various foreign wars throughout history that people were buried overseas. And we talked a little bit about, and I'm going to wrap up, but you got me on the whole cenotaph thing. I think we both said it. I'm not sure that we actually said what it was. Right. Not everybody may be privy to that term. A cenotaph is a stone that marks a burial place, much like a gravestone. However, there is no body interred. And it's not for if there's an urn interred, that's called an inurnment, by the way. And it's not as if there is a body there. It is for people. What would be some of the examples? You said Titanic, lost at sea.
Lost at sea. The bodies are lost in war, never recovered, or the body's buried elsewhere, and the family wants the person memorialized in their plot. Joyce Kilmer, killed in World War I. He's buried in an American military cemetery in France. He has a big monument in his family cemetery in Elwood Cemetery in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Okay. He's not buried there, but he has a big monument there as if he is, because the family opted to keep him with his comrades in France, but still want to memorialize him on their family plot. So that's a great example of a cenotaph.
That is, it is. And so there's, I think also Jane Mansfield.
Jane Mansfield has she's buried in Penn Argyll, PA.
I was going to say I know she's buried on one coast and memorialized on the other coast.
In the West Coast, she has a memorial stone on the West Coast.
So the stone that you find, I believe is it in Hollywood Forever?
Hollywood Forever, yes.
Yes, the stone.
Don't call me that, but I believe that's where it is.
I think so too, because I want to think I've seen it. Because we were saying I've been to the West Coast. Hollywood Forever is a lot of fun. The folks there really, I thought, started pioneering a really cool way to do death, and they've tried to right a lot of the old wrongs also that had gone on with burial practices pre-civil rights era. So they're doing some wonderful things. They're moving and shaking over at Hollywood Forever. If you're in that area, if you're a West Coaster, check out the programs they have. Their movie nights and everything, absolutely amazing. But yes, so Jane Mansfield has a marker because so many famous people are buried there, and that people who are looking and to memorialize, and she worked and thrived in California, but her family is it outside of Bryn Mawr? It's
Penn Argyll, PA, where she's buried.
And that's I believe a suburb of that area.
It's up in the northeast part of Pennsylvania.
Okay, so northeast Pennsylvania, northeast of Philadelphia, and way going up a little further than that.
A little further than that, yeah.
But there's I hope you get a chance to get out to the West Coast, because I can recommend.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it never rains either when you're out in the cemeteries there. Like, I've gotten caught in all kinds of ridiculous weather in different cemeteries, and it's just been, just you and we've been rained on. I think we saw hail at least once, and there's wind and all that stuff. You go out and this in Southern California, the weather is ridiculously perfect. Right. And you can't swing a dead cat. Not that you should. Without hitting an incredibly famous person, from the Ramones to Tyrone Power, Fairbanks, Jr., Senior. It's all out there.
And the Mills are out there too.
Oh, who is?
The Mills, Cecil B.
Oh, yes. There's that. And the list is endless. And so if you're interested in a little bit of graveside tourism, I think wherever you are, you're going to find that you're going to have some wonderful folks to explore, because, as we said, and I think this should be our theme, there's a story behind every stone. Right. Thank you so much, Russ, for a little bit over an hour conversation. Thank you so much, Russ, for a beautiful conversation. Almost 2 decades of friendship.
Yes.
And who knows what else. I hope you get to that bucket list item and items, as much well regard to you and yours. I hope everybody stays safe and well. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rock. And you'll hear about everything of my future endeavors in the bucket list cemeteries I plan to go to.
We'll look forward to checking back with you. All right, Russ, take care.
All right. See you, Rock.
Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.